I was sent away when my stepmom had her own kids. Now she's asking me to help raise them because she was so funny, but I'm Aiden, 24 now, and this story begins when I was 12. Looking back, it feels like another lifetime. My mom passed away when I was young, and after a few years of just me and Dad, he met Lauren. She was lively, outgoing, and, at first, seemed like a breath of fresh air. I actually liked her. I was a shy kid, and Lauren had a way of making everyone around her feel noticed. For a while, things felt normal. Dad seemed happy, which made me happy. Lauren even made an effort to include me in things, like family outings or dinner nights. At 12, you don't notice subtle changes, so I didn't realize how things started shifting when she became pregnant. At 13, I was pretty excited about the idea of siblings, imagining all the ways we'd bond and have each other's backs as we grew up. But when Lauren gave birth to twins, Lily and Mason, everything changed. I had just turned 14, and I don't know if it was hormones or just regular family dynamics, but it quickly became obvious that I was more of an accessory than a priority. While Lauren had been great at keeping everyone in her circle, she now had two small humans who were her entire world, and it was like I ceased to exist. Dad was busy trying to juggle his job and the new babies, so he didn't see it at first, but I did. Dinners became more about Lauren talking about Lily's first smile or Mason's new sounds. If I tried to share anything, like my grades or a project I was proud of, it was brushed aside, or worse, ignored. Then came the real blow. When I was 16, Lauren and Dad sat me down and told me they thought it might be best if I moved in with my Aunt Sarah, who lived about 2 hours away. They said it would be good for me, new experiences, a fresh start. Lauren phrased it like she was doing me a favor, painting it as an exciting opportunity. Dad just sat there quietly, nodding, and I, being the loyal son, tried to believe them. But inside, I knew what it was. I was in the way. It was weird at first, being suddenly shipped off to Aunt Sarah's. I loved her, sure, but she had her own life. She was single, lived alone, and didn't really know how to deal with a teenage boy who had just been, essentially, cast out by his own family. I spent a lot of time alone in my room, wondering what I'd done wrong. I tried calling Dad a few times, but he was always busy, with Lauren or the twins or work. Calls became shorter, then less frequent, and eventually stopped. I didn't visit, and no one came to visit me. I graduated high school, worked a few jobs, and saved up enough to move out at 19. I was done relying on anyone else. I was going to make my own life, away from them. They didn't call. I didn't call. Eventually, I stopped thinking about them at all. Until a few weeks ago, when a message popped up on my phone, a number I didn't recognize but immediately knew. It was Lauren. I almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity got the better of me. Aiden, we need to talk. Your father isn't well, and things at home are challenging. The twins are now teenagers, and we could really use your help around the house. I reread it, disbelief bubbling up. It had been years since any of them reached out to me, and now, suddenly, they needed me? I spent the next few days turning it over in my mind. Part of me wanted to reply with a sarcastic, "Oh, now you remember I exist?" But another part of me, one I hated admitting to, was curious. I had questions. Why now? Why me? And maybe, deep down, I still missed my dad. So, after a lot of back and forth, I texted back, agreeing to meet with them to talk. When I arrived at their house, the one I'd lived in for those brief years, I was hit by an uncomfortable wave of nostalgia. Everything looked the same, but somehow smaller. Dad was there to greet me at the door. He looked older, frail even, with gray hair and lines around his eyes. I barely recognized him. I swallowed the lump in my throat. For all the resentment I had, he was still my dad, and seeing him so diminished hurt. Lauren came to the door, her smile just a bit too tight. The years hadn't changed her much. She was still put together, with a face full of barely hidden intentions. She led me into the kitchen, where we sat awkwardly. I realized then that neither of the twins was around, and I wondered if they even knew who I was, or if they cared. After some small talk, Lauren finally got to the point. "Your father's health has been challenging lately," she began, choosing her words carefully. "And with Mason and Lily being teenagers, things are, well, chaotic, to say the least." It's a lot for one person to manage. I tried not to laugh out loud. Was she serious? After all these years, she was now overwhelmed? Where was all that determination when she'd pushed me out the door? I asked, so why reach out to me now? Why not? I don't know. Reach out years ago? She looked slightly uncomfortable but didn't miss a beat. Aiden, we thought giving you some space was best. You were at an age where having a change of scenery could benefit you, right? A change of scenery, I echoed, struggling to keep the sarcasm out of my voice. She took a deep breath. Look, maybe we made mistakes, but your father could really use you here. The kids could use a good role model. You're doing well for yourself, I hear. Her words struck a nerve. I looked at Dad, who just sat there, nodding slightly. He was pale, looking tired, but still silent. I wanted to ask him so many things. Why had he let her do this? Why had he chosen her over me? But all I saw was his weary face, and I couldn't bring myself to press him. I had no interest in helping Lauren, but Dad, he was a different story. Just as I was trying to sort out my next move, Mason walked in. At 16, he was taller than me, with dark hair and a distant expression that felt strangely familiar. He nodded at me, muttering a quiet hey. Lauren's face softened immediately. She practically glowed with pride. I wondered if she'd ever looked at me like that. I watched Mason and Lauren exchange a look before he disappeared up the stairs, saying nothing more. There was an awkward silence before Lauren continued her pitch. I think this would be a good way for us to reconnect, she said. For the family. I looked at Dad again, and he finally met my eyes. Please, Aiden, he whispered. Just give it a try. Against my better judgment, I nodded. But something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. I decided to stay for a couple of days, mostly to clear my head and try to make sense of this twisted situation. After all, Dad had practically begged me to stay, and I couldn't shake the image of his frail face. I'd rented a small apartment in a nearby town to keep things low-key and give myself an easy out if things got too intense. But for now, I was there. Lauren seemed unusually eager to keep me busy, assigning me various chores around the house. I tried to stay civil, mostly because I didn't want to make Dad uncomfortable, but the tension between us was palpable. She seemed to alternate between trying to make small talk and avoiding any real conversation with me. It was as if we were playing roles in some bizarre, unspoken game. The next day, I found myself alone with Mason, who I'd barely exchanged words with. He was polite enough, but distant, like he had his guard up. I understood that. After all, I was practically a stranger to him. We'd only had a couple of run-ins as kids, and those memories were mostly faded snapshots. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, like he was studying my every move. In the late afternoon, as I was fixing a broken fence in the backyard, Mason wandered over and leaned against a nearby post, watching me work. For a while, he didn't say anything, just stared off into the distance. Finally, he broke the silence. So, what made you decide to come back? I shrugged, wiping sweat off my forehead. Guess I was curious. I mean, your mom didn't really give me much choice with how she phrased things. He smirked, as if amused by my response. She's good at that, isn't she? I raised an eyebrow, curious. What do you mean? He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder to make sure we were alone. She has this way of getting people to do what she wants. She makes it sound like it's for their own good, but it's really for her. This confession caught me off guard. I'd expected Mason to be loyal to his mother, especially given how close they seemed. But here he was, practically warning me not to trust her. I wondered if he'd seen more than I realized. Before I could respond, he leaned in closer. Look, Aiden, you don't know the half of it. She didn't just bring you back for Dad. There's more going on. I studied his face, noting the tension in his jaw. What are you saying? He hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. She wants something from you. I don't know exactly what, but it's not just about Dad or us needing you around. There's something else. Just be careful. I nodded, processing his words. Mason seemed genuine, and for some reason, I trusted him. Despite the distance between us, we shared a sense of being on the outside looking in. It was strange to feel a connection with this kid who was technically my brother, but who had grown up in a completely different world. Over the next few days, I started paying more attention to the dynamics around the house. It didn't take long to notice that Lauren was oddly controlling, especially when it came to Dad's interactions with me. She always seemed to hover, subtly steering our conversations back toward her and the family's needs. If Dad and I tried to talk alone, she'd inevitably find a way to interrupt, either with a chore she needed help with or some minor crisis with the twins. Then there was Lily, who, at 16, was every bit the moody teenager. I had yet to have a single conversation with her that didn't end in an eye roll or a huffy sigh. Unlike Mason, who seemed at least somewhat curious about me, Lily clearly resented my presence. She barely acknowledged me, preferring to lock herself in her room or bury her face in her phone whenever I was around. I'd given up trying to make small talk with her. It was obvious I wasn't welcome in her world. On the third night, I overheard Lauren and Dad talking in the kitchen after dinner. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but their voices carried, and the tone of their conversation drew me in. "I'm telling you, we need his help," Lauren was saying, her voice tight with irritation. "You know we can't manage everything on our own. And the business, well, it's not exactly what it used to be." Dad sounded tired, his words soft and unsteady. "But it's not fair to ask Aiden for financial help, Lauren. He's just getting started himself. And after everything..." "Everything," she scoffed. "Oh, come on. He's not some poor victim. He's grown up now. He can pitch in like the rest of us." I felt my stomach tighten. Financial help? Was that what this was all about? Had they brought me back to guilt-trip me into supporting them? I turned away, retreating to my room as quietly as possible. My mind was racing, filled with anger, hurt, and confusion. I'd come back, put myself in this awkward, painful situation, and now they wanted me to bankroll their lives? I could barely believe it. The next morning, I decided I needed answers. I found Dad alone in the living room, sipping his coffee and staring out the window. He looked worn, his face lined with exhaustion and something else, maybe regret. I took a deep breath and sat down next to him. "Dad," I began carefully, "can we talk? About why you wanted me here?" He glanced over at me, his expression guarded. "Of course, son. What's on your mind?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. I overheard you and Lauren talking last night about finances and me helping out. I need to know the truth. Am I here because you need help, or is there something more going on?" He looked away, his fingers tightening around his coffee mug. For a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer. But then he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Aiden, I didn't want to ask you for anything. I just wanted to see you again. Have you be part of our lives. I know things didn't go the way they should have." His words hit me hard. I could tell he was struggling, that there was more he wasn't saying. I pressed gently, "So, the financial stuff, that's Lauren's idea?" He nodded, looking ashamed. She thinks you're successful and that maybe you'd be willing to help us out. I tried to tell her it wasn't fair to ask you. But she's worried, Aiden. Things haven't been easy for us, especially with the business struggling." I took a deep breath, feeling a mix of anger and pity. It was like Dad was caught in Lauren's orbit, unable to break free from her expectations. He wanted to reconnect, but Lauren had twisted it into something self-serving. And now, I was in the middle of their mess. As I mulled over my options, Mason appeared at the doorway, watching us quietly. I realized he'd probably heard part of our conversation, but he didn't say anything, just gave me a small nod of understanding. Later that night, Mason found me again. "You okay?" he asked, leaning against my doorway. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a small smile. "Just processing, I guess." He nodded, his face serious. "Look, if you're thinking of helping them, just be careful. Don't trust everything she says. Mom can be persuasive, but she doesn't always tell the whole story." His words lingered with me long after he left. I felt trapped in a web of old resentments and new obligations, unsure who I could trust. And with every passing day, I started to see Lauren's true intentions more clearly. This wasn't just about family. It was about her control, her manipulation. And if I didn't find a way to break free, I was going to get tangled up in her schemes all over again. After my conversation with Mason, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Lauren was up to something bigger. Her attempts to draw me in were becoming more blatant, almost as if she was desperate to secure my help. But every time I tried to talk to Dad alone, she found a reason to insert herself. It was like she was determined to keep me from getting any real answers. One night, after another forced family dinner, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The air was cold and refreshing, a welcome break from the tension inside the house. I didn't go far, just down to the end of the block and back, but when I returned, I noticed something strange. The lights in the living room were still on, and through the front window, I could see Lauren and Dad locked in an intense conversation. Curious, I crept closer, trying to catch their words. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't resist. This family was full of secrets, and I was tired of being left in the dark. Inheritance. We've talked about this before, Robert, Lauren was saying, her voice sharp and insistent. Dad looked uncomfortable, glancing down at his hands. I told you, Lauren, I don't want to cut him out. Aiden is still my son. No matter what happened. He deserves something. Lauren's face twisted with frustration. Are you serious? After everything? He left, Robert. He wanted nothing to do with us for years. And now you're ready to just hand over what's rightfully Mason and Lily's. Dad sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. It's not about handing anything over. It's about doing the right thing. I can't just erase him from my life because it's convenient for you. My heart pounded as I pieced together what they were discussing. Lauren had been trying to push me out of any potential inheritance, ensuring her children, her biological children, were the only ones who benefited. And Dad, despite his weaknesses, was standing his ground, refusing to let her cut me out completely. But how long would he hold out against her? The conversation eventually died down, and Lauren stormed off to bed, leaving Dad alone in the dimly lit room. I took a deep breath, my emotions swirling. I wanted to confront them, to demand answers. But instead, I went back to my room, too overwhelmed to deal with the chaos that night. I needed a plan, a way to get the truth without tipping Lauren off. The next morning, Mason and I managed to catch a few minutes alone in the garage. I told him what I'd overheard, and his eyes widened with a mixture of shock and frustration. I knew she was trying to control things, but this is worse than I thought, he said, clenching his fists. Mom has always been overbearing, but trying to cut you out entirely? That's messed up. I appreciated his support, but I couldn't help wondering where his loyalty truly lay. He was still her son, after all. And yet, he seemed genuinely angry, as if he were finally seeing Lauren's manipulative side for the first time. I don't know what to do, I admitted. Part of me wants to just walk away and let them deal with their own mess. But then there's Dad. He's not perfect, but he's still my father. And I can tell he wants to make things right, even if he's too weak to stand up to her. Mason nodded thoughtfully. You should talk to him directly, one-on-one. Get him out of the house, away from her. Maybe you can finally get some honest answers without her breathing down his neck. It was a solid plan, and I decided to give it a shot. That afternoon, I suggested to Dad that we take a drive together, just the two of us. He looked hesitant, probably worried about Lauren's reaction, but I could see a flicker of relief in his eyes. We ended up at a small park outside of town, sitting on a bench with a view of a frozen lake. Dad seemed more relaxed away from the house, but I could still sense the weight of everything he was carrying. Dad, I began, trying to keep my tone calm. I need to know what's really going on. Lauren's been vague, but I get the feeling there's more to this than just you needing help around the house. He sighed, his shoulders sagging as if he were finally letting down a burden he'd carried for years. Aiden, I owe you an apology. I should have fought harder to keep you with us. I was weak. I let Lauren convince me that sending you to live with Sarah was best. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. His words stung, but they also gave me a sense of closure. For years, I'd wondered if he even cared about the choice they'd made to send me away, but hearing him admit his regret made me feel seen, even if it was years too late. So why bring me back now? I asked gently. What's really going on with the inheritance? And why is Lauren so determined to cut me out? He hesitated, glancing down at his hands. It's true that our finances aren't great. The business is barely holding on, and I'm not sure how much longer we can keep things afloat. Lauren, she thinks the only way we can secure a future for Lily and Mason is to control every penny we have. But I won't just erase you, Aiden. You're still my son. I nodded, my anger cooling into something more like pity. Lauren had twisted him around so completely that he was willing to betray his own beliefs to keep her happy. I realized then that he was as much a victim of her manipulation as I was. After our conversation, I felt more determined than ever to protect my place in the family, even if it meant standing up to Lauren directly. She'd had control for far too long, and it was time for me to take back what was rightfully mine. That night, after Dad had gone to bed, I cornered Mason in the hallway. I need your help, I whispered. If we're going to figure this out, I need someone on the inside. Can I trust you? He looked at me, his expression conflicted but resolute. You can trust me, Aiden. Mom's my mother, but I can't stand by and watch her do this to you. It's not right. Together, we hatched a plan. Mason would keep an eye on Lauren, monitoring her conversations and activities. He'd already noticed her taking late-night phone calls and disappearing on errands without explaining where she was going. It was becoming clearer that she was hiding something she didn't want any of us to know. The following evening, Mason slipped into my room, his face pale. You're not going to believe this, he whispered, holding up his phone. I found some emails on Mom's laptop. She's been talking to a lawyer about changing Dad's will. She wants to make sure you're completely cut out, that everything goes to Lily and me. My blood ran cold. I knew she was manipulative, but this was a new level of betrayal. She was trying to rewrite history, to erase me from my own family. And worst of all, she was using Dad's failing health as an excuse to push her plans through. We can't let this happen, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I need to talk to Dad, show him what she's doing. He has to know. Mason nodded, his eyes filled with determination. I'll back you up, Aiden. Whatever you need, I'm here. The next morning, I confronted Lauren. She was in the kitchen, sipping her coffee with a smug look on her face, as if she'd already won. We need to talk, I said firmly, stepping into the room. She looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to annoyance. Oh, about what? About your plans to rewrite Dad's will, I said, watching her face closely. For a split second, I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with a tight smile. I don't know what you're talking about. Cut the act, Lauren. Mason found your emails. I know you're trying to push me out, to make sure everything goes to Lily and Mason. But that's not going to happen. She glared at me, her mask slipping. You don't know anything, Aiden. You left us. You abandoned this family, and now you think you can just waltz back in and take what you don't deserve. I took a deep breath, fighting to keep my composure. I didn't abandon anyone. You pushed me out because you couldn't handle having a stepson around. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Dad deserves to know the truth. Her face twisted with rage, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out. But then she took a step back, her expression calculating. Fine, she said coldly. Go ahead, tell him. But remember this, Aiden. You may be his son, but you're still an outsider here. And when push comes to shove, he'll choose me and the twins over you. Just like he always has. Her words cut deep, but I refused to let her intimidate me. This time, I wasn't going to let her win. After that confrontation with Lauren, I felt like I was walking on eggshells around the house. She kept her distance, but every time I caught her looking at me, her eyes were icy, filled with barely veiled contempt. It was clear she wasn't giving up her plans. I needed to act quickly, and the only ally I had in this twisted game was Mason. Over the next few days, Mason and I dug deeper. He continued sneaking onto Lauren's laptop whenever she wasn't around, looking for anything that could give us leverage. One night, he came to my room looking more serious than I'd ever seen him. I think I found something big, he said, barely able to contain his excitement. I leaned in, my pulse quickening. What is it? Mason opened his phone and showed me a string of emails from Lauren's account. The most recent one was to a lawyer, but this time, it wasn't just about changing Dad's will. She'd been inquiring about how to liquidate assets and move money into an offshore account. It was the kind of thing you'd do if you were planning to take off, money in hand, leaving no trace. Why would she need an offshore account? I asked, my mind racing. And why keep this a secret? Mason shook his head, looking as bewildered as I felt. I don't know, but it doesn't sound good, does it? We kept going through the emails, piecing together a narrative that made my skin crawl. Lauren had been slowly moving money around, siphoning it out of my dad's business accounts and stashing it in separate accounts under her name. And here was the worst part. She had already started withdrawing money from dad's personal savings. She'd been planning this for years, siphoning off funds in small amounts so dad wouldn't notice. It was a carefully orchestrated betrayal, and we'd stumbled into the middle of it. I sat back, feeling nauseous. She's bleeding him dry. And with his health, my voice trailed off as the reality of the situation sank in. She's probably waiting for him to, pass. Mason finished quietly. Once he's gone, she'll have control of everything. It all clicked into place. Lauren didn't just want me out of the picture because of an inheritance. She wanted complete control, without any interference. If dad passed away, she'd have the house, the accounts, everything. And she'd been building her own little escape plan on the side, just in case things went south. Mason looked at me, his face pale. We have to show dad. He needs to know what she's doing. I agreed, but I knew it wasn't going to be easy. Dad was frail, and I had no idea how he'd react to such a massive betrayal. But if we didn't tell him, he'd lose everything he'd worked for, and Lauren would walk away, unscathed. The next morning, I woke up early, determined to talk to Dad before Lauren could interfere. I found him in his study, looking over some old papers, his brow furrowed with concentration. I took a deep breath and walked in, closing the door behind me. Dad, I said quietly, sitting down across from him. There's something you need to know. It's about Lauren. He looked up, startled, his tired eyes studying me. What about her? I hesitated, then handed him Mason's phone with the emails pulled up. She's been taking money from you. For years. Actually, she's been hiding it in separate accounts, and now she's looking into an offshore account. She's planning something, Dad, and I think she's been hoping to cut me out so she'd have full control when, well, if anything happened to you. He stared at the screen, his hands shaking as he scrolled through the emails. The color drained from his face, and he seemed to age 10 years in that moment. I don't believe it, he whispered, his voice barely audible. She wouldn't do this. She's my wife. I felt a pang of sympathy but pushed forward. Dad, I know this is hard to hear, but it's all right there. She's been siphoning money, and now she's making plans to leave. If we don't do something, she's going to take everything. He buried his face in his hands, and for a moment, I thought he might break down completely. But then he took a deep breath and looked up, his eyes filled with a new determination. You're right, Aiden. We can't let her get away with this. For the first time since I'd come back, I felt a surge of hope. Dad was willing to stand up to her, to protect what was left of our family. But as we began discussing what to do next, the doors swung open, and there stood Lauren, her face contorted with rage. What are you doing? She demanded, her voice shaking. What lies has he been feeding you, Robert? Dad looked at her, a mixture of anger and sadness in his eyes. No more lies, Lauren. I know everything. I know about the money you've been taking. I know about the offshore accounts. I trusted you, and you betrayed me. She laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. Oh, please. You've been a shell of a man for years, Robert. You can't even take care of yourself, let alone this family. I did what I had to do to keep us afloat. Dad's hands trembled as he clenched them into fists. You did it for yourself, Lauren. You wanted control. You wanted everything. Her gaze shifted to me, venomous. And what about you, Aiden? You think you're some hero now, coming back to save the day? You abandoned this family. You don't get to waltz back in and play savior. I stood my ground, refusing to let her words affect me. I left because you pushed me out, Lauren. You didn't want me here. But I'm back now, and I'm not letting you take advantage of Dad any longer. For a moment, I thought she might actually lunge at me. But then she took a step back, her expression cold and calculating. Fine. You want to play family? Go ahead. But don't think for a second that you can get rid of me that easily. I'll fight for everything I've built, and you won't stand a chance." With that, she turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Dad and I sat there in silence, the weight of the confrontation settling over us. "What now?" I asked, breaking the silence. Dad sighed, looking exhausted. "We get a lawyer. We protect what we can. And we make sure she doesn't take another penny." Over the next few days, Dad and I worked closely with an attorney, gathering evidence of Lauren's misdeeds. Mason, despite his conflicted feelings, helped as much as he could, digging up documents and providing the emails as proof. Lily, however, was harder to reach. She idolized her mother and had no idea what was really going on. Whenever I tried to talk to her, she would shut down, refusing to listen. But Lauren wasn't done yet. She still had a few tricks up her sleeve. One evening, I returned from a meeting with Dad's lawyer to find Lauren waiting for me in the living room. Her face was calm, almost serene, but her eyes were cold. "We could have worked something out, Aiden," she said, her voice dangerously soft. "But you had to come back here, stirring up trouble. You have no idea who you're dealing with." I crossed my arms, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm not afraid of you, Lauren. You don't scare me." Her lips curled into a sinister smile. "You should be. You think you've won? You haven't even scratched the surface. I have connections, Aiden. People who owe me favors. And if you keep pushing, I'll make sure you regret it." The threat was thinly veiled, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I'd underestimated Lauren's determination, her willingness to go to any lengths to protect herself. I knew she was manipulative, but this was a new level of malice. I walked away, determined not to show any fear. But as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Lauren had always been calculating, but now she was desperate, and that made her dangerous. I wasn't sure what her next move would be, but I knew one thing for certain. This fight was going to get ugly. And if I wasn't careful, I might lose everything. The days that followed felt like a standoff. Lauren kept her distance, her every glance filled with silent threats. Dad, Mason, and I continued working with the lawyer, building a case to secure Dad's assets. But I knew Lauren wouldn't just sit back and watch her plans unravel. Then, one evening, Dad pulled me aside. He looked exhausted but determined. "Aiden," he said quietly, "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time I stepped back from the business entirely. I want to make sure you and Mason are both taken care of, and I don't want Lauren having any control over it." The gravity of his decision hit me. He was willing to walk away from everything he'd built just to protect us. It felt bittersweet. For the first time, I saw Dad choosing me over Lauren, but I could also tell how much this cost him. We finalized the paperwork that week, legally locking Lauren out of Dad's accounts and the family business. Her reaction was explosive. She shouted, accused Dad of betrayal, and hurled insults my way. But when she realized she'd lost, she went silent, the fire in her eyes replaced with a cold fury. She packed a bag and left that night without a word, disappearing into the same shadows she'd once wielded so easily. In the quiet aftermath, our family started to heal. Lily eventually warmed up, and Mason and I grew close in a way I'd never imagined. Dad and I spent more time together, finally rebuilding the bond we'd lost so many years ago. For once, I felt like I belonged, like I had a family again. As for Lauren, I never heard from her again.